Hi everyone. So we are combining a couple of PowerPoints in my little lecture at this morning, afternoon, whatever it might be for you when you're watching this. So we are looking in this module at both Chapter 7, where the focus is on a reflection of feelings and how we help clients to see how there's feeling under all the statements that they're giving us and the stories that they're telling us. There's emotions and feelings behind the actions. And so we're looking at Chapter 7 mainly, the whole thing, and then a little part of Chapter 2, and putting a lot of focus this week on multicultural competence and working with clients from various backgrounds, and how we can address our perception of culture and how we view ourselves as cultural entities and human beings in the world in which we live. So I put a lot of information on the web or on the eCampus module about multicultural competence because I did want to make that more of an emphasis this week. We'll talk about it a little bit on campus because there are certainly multicultural counseling theories that are different from just kind of that general requirement, if you will, that all counselors possess a certain level of multicultural competence in order to be effective counselors. So there's kind of this need for us to develop and maintain and continue to grow in competence in working with individuals from various backgrounds. And then there's concrete kind of theories, if you will, of practice around multiculturalism. So I put a good deal of information on multicultural competence just to expand on what the chapter offered, but then of course kind of hoping that you'll read the Chapter 7 in its entirety, and there's not as much in terms of reflection of feeling that I can provide other than the slides and the intent of talking to you a little bit more about it. And so these next couple of chapters are kind of going to be that same way, reflection of feeling and emotion, and what all of that means. So when we're thinking about reflection of feelings, so if we're thinking about that hierarchy of the pyramid, right, and being effective counselors and using these micro skills, so when we're thinking about reflecting feelings back to our clients, it might sound a little elementary, but sometimes it is simply stating, I see that you're sad, or I'm hearing that you're angry about this situation. Sometimes it's just simply stating back what that emotion is that you're getting from the client. And in some instances, that can be enough to highlight that emotion and that feeling as part of the client's story in a way that they might not have otherwise identified or self-identified with that feeling. So the purpose of reflecting feelings are to find these kind of deeply held thoughts within our clients, the meaning behind the stories that they're telling us, a meaning behind their life experiences, their lived experiences. And so we're kind of getting deeper into a story, because up until now, right, if we're talking about interviewing and working with clients and doing like an intake, let's say, just kind of gathering the information. You're sitting back, you're asking questions in the right way, you're paraphrasing and summarizing information, and now we're kind of getting deeper into it, right? When we think about kind of the quintessential counselor, therapist, psychotherapist with a client on the couch, it's a reflection of feeling that we're looking into. So we're offering an interpretation into a client's experience based on what they're telling us, or based on some of those nonverbal cues that they're giving us. And it might not be that they're, they are crying, although a lot of times clients do cry, so you should probably become comfortable with that at some point. But maybe it is an outward expression of emotion, or maybe they are, if they're angry about something, their face is getting flushed. So it may be that you're able to see that that expression of a feeling or emotion more concretely. Other times it may just come out through a tone of voice, or somebody speaking softer about a situation that might have kind of that louder tone to start out with. So we're offering kind of an interpretation of what we're seeing and what we're hearing from a client in the story that they're telling us. Doing that, we're obviously assisting clients to kind of explore their own values and goals. If it is that they're feeling sad or angry or mad or disappointed about a situation, we're able to use those feelings that they're expressing to us to get a better understanding of what their goal is. If it's a change in how they might feel about a situation or about an event or about themselves, then we're able to kind of use that expression of feeling that we get from a client early on to help us to set some goals. So if somebody is feeling unhappy about their current situation, a goal would, again, elementary way here, a goal would be to feel happier about a situation. Or, if they're disappointed, to be accepting of a circumstance. And so it can be very helpful in terms of the goal setting process, to kind of focus on these emotions that our clients are displaying. So obviously we need to be able to recognize emotions. I have this wonderful book that I read to my children that's like little people running around with hearts, and it's saying, today I was feeling sad, and this is what sad sounds like. And today I was happy, and this is what happy sounds like. Or today I was bashful. And, not that I'm naming off 7 doors here, but it's literally a book that expresses emotions, because there are so many emotions in a human being, right? And that can be conveyed. It could be disgust, surprised, scared, timid, frightened, shy, whatever it might be. So it's part of our job to recognize kind of the nonverbal and verbal expressions of these, and then to try to process the meaning behind the feelings. So the value in being positive, we always talk about having a strength-based focus in counseling now, even though historically counselors weren't really focusing on the positive. There was a more of a focus on the negative. And if you're looking at kind of those the older foundational orientations, psychoanalysis, for instance, you can see the reason why those have continued to be used now in the postmodern era is that there's been some modification around how therapists approach psychoanalysis, for example. So it's not always a focus on what an individual can't do, what they're unable to do, what their limitations are, or the negative thinking and negative patterns of behavior, but rather acknowledging those and then using our language and our approach to the counseling session to highlight the positive aspects of a person's life, right? To the extent that there's positive therapy right now, positive psychotherapy is a whole new movement, if you will, which is incredibly strength-based and continuously looking at the positives. Now, we know that from a neuropsychology perspective, positive emotion produces chemical changes in the brain. There are releases of dopamine and serotonin that results in kind of these positive physical changes that not only can those chemical changes produce changes in our emotional state, but having, the body and the mind kind of focused on strengths and the positive aspects of one's life can also do wonders for physical health as well. So how do we do that? How do we always maintain that positive outlook, that positive perspective? Because let's be real, counselors are human beings, and sometimes we have bad days too, and it can be difficult, especially because people are coming to us with the negatives, with problems in their lives, and so it can be daunting to think about having to be positive all the time. But it simply can be a shift in how we approach our responses to people. If somebody is saying, I can't, then you could kind of refocus attention on what they can do, or I'm unable to do this, and my doctor says I can't do this, and that I'm limited in this way. What are you able to do? What are you able to do on a day-to-day basis? When you get up in the morning, what's the first thing you can do? So, just kind of shifting our pattern of our belief about how somebody can function, even taking into consideration any kind of mental health impairment or physical impairment that somebody might have. So I provided some examples on slide 5 of what this actually might sound like, in terms of reflecting, feeling. Again, a lot of times it is just a matter of being pretty abrupt and outright in what you're seeing from a client. It seems like you're sad. It seems like you're unhappy about the situation. I hear sadness in your voice, or I hear hopefulness in your voice, and that's a great thing to hear today. So, it can go either way, but that's going to be my little spiel on reflection of feelings. And so I'm going to switch it over to multicultural competence now. All right, so the little section that we read in chapter 2, again, is a very little section, right? Not a lot going into this. But I did want to expand a little bit more in terms of providing an understanding of what multicultural counseling is, or what it should be. and multicultural competence. Okay, so multicultural counseling is where we're basically recognizing that there's diversity across across our client populations, right? We're embracing the diversity. We are appreciating the worth and the value that our clients bring to us in terms of opening our eyes to different cultures, different belief systems, different value systems, to their potential, the uniqueness of a client, the histories of our clients. We're embracing all of that information, and we are kind of like sponges, more or less, working with clients that are from different backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds than ours. And so we are open to understanding somebody else's life experience. So if we're thinking about the term multicultural, now some people have problems with this term in the counseling world. I'll say that because if we think about like the actual like literal definition of culture, then it's like, well, does everything fit nicely into this little box, if you will? But if we're thinking about multicultural in general terms, we're talking about somebody's cultural backgrounds, race, ethnicity, different minority statuses. Females can be in that category, of course, gender minority status, sexual orientation, disability status, individuals that kind of use the term multiculturalism in the broadest of terms, or diversity in the broadest of terms. Will include socioeconomic status in there, age, different ways that somebody might have been brought up. So it just depends on the piece of literature you're reading at that point. So open for a bit of interpretation, but nevertheless, I personally like to think of diversity in more of the broader scope, but also understanding that there can be different sectors or populations of individuals that may hold minority status in one realm, but also minority status in another. So it just depends on the context, I think. So culture is where we're thinking about a group of individuals that have traditions of thought and behavior that are learned and transmitted across generations. And so this is, culture can be dynamic, it can be continuously changing. They can be individualistic, as we are here in the United States, collective, as most of the other world's population is, collectivist cultures. And so this is, if you're having a hard time thinking about different cultures that are around you, I mean, sometimes if we're living in West Virginia especially, Appalachian culture is certainly a culture in and of itself. There are different thoughts and behaviors and traditions that persist within Appalachia that are unique to that one demographic area in the country, right? But again, that's one of those areas where it's, you've got, generally speaking, white people that are Appalachian culture, and so that they're also members of a dominant culture, right? So it can get a little bit tricky. Race is a social construct, right? There's no biological or scientific definition of race, but yet we use racial categories to classify other people who have distinct physical characteristics, people that may not look the same as us or are going to be from typically a different racial category. From a counseling perspective and thinking about race and the impact of race on the counseling profession, if you think about theories and the roots and foundations of counseling, a lot of, even looking at like the DSM, for example, everything was kind of focused on white culture, right? White middle-class society is what was studied back in the day, and we were looking at what was considered abnormal when we were basing everything on the normal person being a middle-class white, well, I'm not going to say American because we're going to go further back than that, but European individual, largely male. And so we have to acknowledge the impact of race and disparities in counseling and addressing what different mental health impairments might look like based on racial category, because we've always normed everything on white people, right? So we have to be aware of that and cognizant of that when we're thinking about different theoretical orientations and why different theories have belief systems around what causes discourse and behavioral changes, patterns of behavior, and things like that. The DSM has a really nice section within it that talks about cultural implications of assigning diagnoses to certain groups of individuals. So I think that's also important to highlight within this class. Ethnicity being a group that shares common history, geography, language, religion, other shared characteristics that distinguish that group from other groups. Minority, groups of individuals whose access to power, so this is kind of a power, this is based on power and influence within a culture or society. So people with individuals with minority status don't have the same access to certain things, or their access is limited by a dominant culture. So this is going to depend. Minority status is dependent on where you might be in the world, right? That could be different for people in the United States of America compared to people in India or Asian countries. It just depends. Worldview, you're going to hear me talk about a lot. Somebody's worldview is how a client, and ourselves as well, how a client perceives his or her, and I shouldn't say that, that's not really I should change the slide, and I probably will, how the client perceives their own relationship to the world, okay? So it's all about the client, what they've experienced from birth until the point that they are looking at you in the face or talking with you on the phone or on a computer, whatever it is. It's every aspect of their being. So where did they grow up? What was their community like? Who were they raised by? What were the values of their family systems and their support systems and their communities? And so we have to, first of all, in terms of developing our own competence as counselors, we have to examine our own worldview, right? We have to understand where our beliefs and values came from in order to better understand how to access a client's worldview. So accessing a client's worldview is an absolute necessity of the entire counseling process, because if we're not accessing a client's worldview, if we're not asking the questions, if we're not open to understanding where a client came from, then it will certainly become a barrier in the work that we're trying to do with them. Now, in terms of competence, you could have clinical competence and not have cultural competence. You could have cultural competence and not have clinical competence. It doesn't automatically, because you have one doesn't automatically mean that you have the other. We might, because of the way that we perceive our culture, the way that our cultural values influence our worldview, maybe we have a great deal of cultural competence, that doesn't always translate into clinical competence. That's why you might be in this program. You might have clinical competence. You might feel like you're, the next best thing since Alfred Adler, if you feel like it. But you may not have cultural competence if you're not working towards gaining cultural competence. Ideally, counselors are both and continuously developing competence in both aspects, right? So competence is not something that we just gain and then that's it. We don't have to worry about it anymore. We always have to continue to grow in our understanding of others. So multicultural competence kind of resides in 4 areas. This is consistent in literature around development of competence in general, but especially multicultural competence. And so at the start of master's programs, we're really hoping that we are helping you all to develop competence in kind of this first area, right? And more so in area 2, once you kind of understand what your own values and your beliefs are, sociopolitical influences that have impacted you. And then kind of the knowledge piece of it comes within the actual coursework, the text readings, supplemental readings, and things of that nature. When we get into the skills part of it, that part of that is, shows within the practicum experience and especially in the internship experience. So that's where you're actually taking the strategies that you've been taught in classes and using them to inform your work with clients from various backgrounds. And then the action part is when you kind of get to the point where you're identifying deficits in organizations that you're working for or in the political system, and taking some extra steps to facilitate change at a higher level. So right now, in this class especially, what I really want you to think about is kind of the first 2 areas in terms of developing multicultural competence. One, I really want you to continue to explore your own values and your beliefs and your own worldview, because, and again, you can't get to know a client's worldview unless you're really, really self-examining yours. And the second part is kind of that knowledge piece of it. So that's how we talk about these things to clients. That's how we develop the cognitive empathy that we actually have to have with clients in order to facilitate an effective therapeutic relationship with them. And the bigger question is, how do you do this, right? Students always want to know that. How in the world do I do this? You know, a lot of times you're going to gain some information through an intake. You're going to get some basic demographic information from forms that are completed by clients to see if they're eligible for your services. Sometimes you're not going to get the whole picture. And so I simply put the addressing framework into my presentation around multicultural competence because I think it really touches on like all of the key areas that you could or should be focusing on when working with a client. And so this is not just based on race or ethnicity, right? And so it's really taking it to the broader, taking diversity kind of from a broader lens and looking at all these different ways that somebody's national heritage, whether you know, they're a first-generation American, whether they're from an indigenous community here, and that has impacted their worldview, whether they have a parent or a sibling or a family member that has a disability, whether they have a disability in addition to that, what type of disability. Is it something that was acquired later in life or something they were born with? Age and generational influences can be especially informative for us, and especially when we're thinking about work and from that kind of rehabilitation counseling perspective. You know, somebody that is new to the world of work is going to have a different perspective on what they may or may not want to be doing versus somebody that's been in the workforce for 40 years and now has an acquired disability and has a major shift in what their goals might be. So if you're going through the addressing framework and you're thinking about, you know, working with clients in that interview or even in a first session, if you kind of keep these topics or headings or status categories in the back of your mind, and you kind of go through and check them off to make sure that you've got a well-rounded picture of who the client is that you're working with. You know, you can, once you have identified, you know, how a person identifies, that's kind of redundant, but once you've asked a client specific questions and you've learned how they identify, then you can go in and kind of fill in the pieces. Do you really understand their culture? Do you really understand their perspective of, you know, being somebody that's a caregiver to both a child with a disability and an aging parent? Do you really understand, you know, how they identify with the gender that they've explained to you as the gender that they identify with? Do you really understand and grasp the concept of all of these things? And if you don't, then you're able to go and either do additional work on your own, right? Do additional readings, seek supervision around that, or ask questions, right? And so how do you ask these different questions? Well, I provided some examples of that on slide 13. Something as simple as how do you describe yourself can really open the door for a client to provide you with some of the information that's critical for you to know as you get to learn who the client is as a person. And I put the resources for this. So Pamela Hayes is the one that the clinician, the educator that developed the addressing framework, and so she's got I've got her paper on the addressing framework here if you're interested in reading the whole thing. But again, that's one of many ways that you can structure an interview, structure that first session with a client so that you are getting a full picture of who somebody is. So with that, I'm going to leave you to the rest of the module, and let me look through here real quick to see if there's anything particular that I wanted to point out. There are a couple of videos. I hope they work. Please let me know if they don't. The one video that I put that was a TED Talk is about communication and culture. And I thought that was a really interesting video to show you guys at this point because obviously we're focusing a lot on communication, right? Patterns of communication. And so you'll learn way more about this whenever you get into the cultural issues course. But I really wanted you to start thinking about how our patterns of communication here in the United States can be different from other cultures and their patterns of communication. And I also like that the speaker in that video identified with three different nationalities, right? And so, you know, when we think about the cultural issues class and a lot of the literature that is out there on cultural competence and counseling, there's a good deal of information that talks about, you know, common ways to work with a specific cultural group, okay? And that's fine, and that we need to be knowing that. You know, we need to know, different ways that an individual who's an African American might view counseling or the process of counseling versus somebody who's an Asian American or Latino American. That's all absolutely important. What I found interesting about this video, and I wanted to kind of highlight, is that not everybody's going to identify with just one specific culture, and even if they do, a lot of times there are subcultures within a culture. And so again, that's why we have to be comprehensive in the way that we ask questions so that we really understand how an individual identifies. All right, and with that, I will leave you guys back to the module and see you all in the discussion board.